is the bigger threat to America? Donald Trump or Ron DeSantis? It seems to be the major question for non-card-carrying Republicans watching the current Republican presidential race, wondering who they should, back, if I can use that phrase. But one that even the DeSantis campaign is leaning into, tweeting out this video.
Ron DeSantis is far more dangerous than Donald Trump.
Far more likely, if he becomes president, to successfully implement a lot of these horrible and disastrous ideas.
Ron DeSantis is a dangerous person and would be a dangerous president.
A more disciplined extremist.
He's smarter than Donald Trump. He's far more strategic.
They actually get mileage from so many people saying, this guy is dangerous.
That's right. Calling Ron DeSantis a dangerous extremist has literally become a selling point for his campaign. And maybe he is more dangerous than Donald. Just look at the last week for Ronald. First, DeSantis distanced himself from and then immediately defended Florida's new education standards for African-American history, backing the idea that black people actually benefited from enslavement. Yes, really.
I didn't do it, and I wasn't involved in it. But I think what they're doing is I think that they're probably going to show some of the folks that eventually parlayed, being a blacksmith into doing things later in life.
And it gets worse. Just 2 days after that, Axios reports a campaign staffer created a video featuring the Florida governor at the center of Nazi imagery. Yes, Nazi imagery. The staffer then shared it from a DeSantis fan account before retweeting it from the campaign. That video was subsequently deleted, and that staffer, Nate Hochman, was fired as part of a major overhaul in the DeSantis campaign. So, the DeSantis campaign is way out there. But at the same time, we also cannot forget how dangerous and, frankly, unhinged Donald J. Trump remains, especially considering his ongoing use of violent and threatening rhetoric.
That have never been done before.
Yes, the man who incited the January 6th insurrection is still making threats, repurposing a recording of a crazy threat he made while president against Iran, what you just saw, but that's now seemingly been redirected this week on social media against his political enemies here at home. And worst of all, he has a heavily armed cult behind him, which seems to actually follow his lead. Let us not forget January the 6th. So look, there clearly is no moderate, non-extreme, non-far-right option between the two Republican frontrunners. And even I find myself on the fence sometimes when it comes to deciding, actually, who is the bigger threat between these two men? But the debate is ongoing, including among two friends of this show. After MSNBC host Katie Phang said she'd take Trump any day over the leaner, meaner DeSantis, Atlantic staff writer and never-Trump conservative Tom Nichols gave Katie a virtual squint for her take, saying DeSantis is awful but Trump is worse. Katie responded that as a Floridian, she has a front-row seat to the cruelty and authoritarian steamrolling of basic human rights at the hands of DeSantis. So who's worse? Who is more dangerous? Who would be the lesser of two evils come November 2024? It's time for an actual debate. Tom Nichols and Katie Phang join me now to make their respective cases. Thank you both for coming on the show. You've briefly gone back and forth on Twitter about who would be more dangerous. Since this is a debate, we're on TV now. I'll give you each a chance to briefly lay out your case. Katie, why is Ron more dangerous than Don?
So Ron is younger, not like age is a factor, because I know that becomes kind of an issue when we talk about the Donald Trump, Joe Biden showdown. But Ron is younger. Ron also has shown that he actually has the ability to implement a slate of hate. If you look at Donald Trump, he was bumbling, a total bumbling idiot, couldn't get the wall up, couldn't deliver on promises, but Ron DeSantis has. I also am going to say the following. I think Ron DeSantis is smarter. He actually has an education, which Donald Trump does not have. But I also think another issue is this. Ron DeSantis has figured out a way to be a leaner, meaner version of Donald Trump. Whether or not it's resonating and whether or not it would eventually resonate in a general, at the end of the day, if you look at DeSantis, he's actually been able to effectively put together a team of enablers that have been able to back him. And I don't really think that you've seen that consistently, even through an entire presidential administration with Donald Trump. And so DeSantis has all of these factors that are militating in his favor should he actually pull off a GOP primary nom.
I mean, he's smarter than Trump. That is a very low bar, of course, Katie. And I would point out that he did bring in the Muslim ban, so he's not completely unable to implement far-right policies. But let me hand over the mic to Tom. He's leaner and meaner than Trump, says Katie.
No, he's just weirder. One of the things that I think is really important in the difference between Ron and Don, nobody's going to storm the Capitol for Ron DeSantis. People don't like him. You know, Mady, in your introduction, you said Donald Trump has a heavily armed cult. That makes all the difference in the world. When you think about a second Trump term where he opens the prisons, hands out hundreds of pardons, creates his own loyalist, mob of convicted criminals, brings all of those people back into the White House, there will be there won't be any guardrails on a second Trump administration. I mean, he'll try and bring Mike Flynn back into the White House, and this Republican Senate will never oppose him. They didn't in the past. Nobody in the Republican Party is really afraid of Ron DeSantis, and DeSantis, in some sense, and I feel like we're just playing the game of horrible alternatives here. But DeSantis at least fears his own donors to some extent. That when he does say something stupid or crazy, he gets calls, and then he kind of panics, and like he did with Ukraine, where he backtracks and he tries to correct himself.
But Tom,
Donald Trump would never have fired Nate Hochman. He would have made him the head of the campaign.
All right, I was going to come in, but Katie, you go.
Well, here's the biggest thing that I guess I neglected to say. Donald Trump is going to go to jail. And he's going to be in a prison cell. And so in some way, maybe this is just an existential rhetorical conversation that we're having right now. But Donald Trump's going to be in prison. I agree with Tom that Donald Trump inspires violence, but I think that it underestimates DeSantis' ability to inspire violence on his own. We've seen a rise in anti-Semitism that happens in Florida, and it's gone unchecked. We have people standing with Nazi flags in front of Disney World, and DeSantis does nothing about it, and nobody does anything. We have brown-shirted election police running around and arresting people for BS election fraud and crimes that haven't been really committed. And so I think that there's actually a real authoritarian regime in Florida, and that's not hyperbolic. And I think that it's actually kind of like a microcosm of what exactly Ron DeSantis wants to do on a larger level. He wants to make America Florida.
Tom, Donald Trump will be in prison. It's Ron DeSantis we have to worry about, the young, fresh face.
No, first of all, I don't share Katie's certitude that Donald Trump's going to be in prison at all. I am not at all certain that will happen. And I think, this notion that DeSantis is somehow a more competent Trump. This is a guy who just got, hamstrung by Walt Disney's lawyers. I mean, there is a kind of comical ineptitude to DeSantis that I think, Trump doesn't care about. Now, I will agree with Katie about one very important thing. DeSantis will probably be better at passing some odious policies that not one of the three of us here would like. But I think that Trump doesn't care about that. Trump's goal on day one will be the destruction of American democracy. And I want to throw in one more thing that we haven't talked about, and that is the idea of Donald Trump as leader of the free world with the nuclear codes at a time of war where Russia is, trying to rampage across Central Europe is about the most dangerous and terrifying thing I can think of in foreign policy right now. So I get it that DeSantis might be the guy who pushes through and gets some bills passed that we're going to hate, but that DeSantis will do that. But Trump will come in and say, here's the first thing I'm going to do. I'm going to pardon myself. I'm going to pardon everybody else. I'm going to bring in, all these goons and felons that I had to get rid of the first time, and I'm going to put them in charge of the CIA and the DOD and the Justice Department. I mean, compared to that, I would rather live through a Ron DeSantis administration than have to fight the battle for democracy starting on day one of a second Trump administration.
Katie, nuclear. Let's just throw nuclear. I just interviewed Miles Taylor on the show on Sunday, former Trump DHS official. He says for the first time since the creation of the DHS, they had to come up with plans for a nuclear attack on the American homeland, thanks to Donald Trump's saber-rattling with Kim Jong-un in his first year in office. You genuinely would prefer Donald Trump's finger on the nuclear button to Ron DeSantis?
This is, again, the most ridiculous conversation we're having between the lesser of two evils. But
that's why we set it up today. It's an important one. It's as important as it is ridiculous.
Ron DeSantis, I would actually put more money on his diplomacy skills than obviously Donald Trump. Ron DeSantis would have the ability to be able to corral a new axis of evil. I think Ron DeSantis would be able to sell the diplomatic value of having other horrible countries and dictators join in and actually participate in something on a global level. Let's be frank. Ron DeSantis and Donald Trump would install yes men and women everywhere in whatever administration happens under, either one of them. But I do think you saw that there were people like Miles Taylor. There were people that kept Donald Trump in check. I think Ron DeSantis would actually stack his administration with people that are smarter or that are just more inclined to sell their soul. Again, a horrible option, but at this point, I still think Ron DeSantis is worse than Donald Trump.
Before I bring Tom back in, I just want to deal with the horrible options thing, right? On the one hand, none of us like Ron DeSantis or Donald Trump.
Oh, yeah.
On the other hand, those are the two front runners in the GOP presidential race. As of today, one of those two men will be the candidate, probably Donald Trump, barring legal issues, if you look at the polls. And therefore, we do have to think about, and liberals have this conversation all the time, and they had it in 2016. Who is the guy who's easier to beat? Let me frame that question to both of you. Put aside your views of who would be a worse president, who is a worse human being, and that's a very long discussion as to who is worse out of these two men. Who would be easier for the Democrats, for Joe Biden to beat, do you think? Tom?
Well, but before you go there, Matey, I think, again, this notion that, DeSantis is this really sly, operator. Listen, if he were that good, he'd be doing a lot better. He wouldn't have to be retooling his campaign and, dragging behind Donald Trump everywhere. He's just not that good. And I think we're just thinking too much of Ron DeSantis's competence here. Yes. So that's a thing I'll take issue with. I don't know. The problem is that Donald Trump has a built-in negative vote, but he also has a built-in loyal base. I mean, in some sense, Ron DeSantis might even be easier to beat in some ways because, again, independents, the more people seem to get to know Ron DeSantis, the less they like him. On the other hand, I will say that he probably would be harder to beat because he simply scares people less than Donald Trump. People know Donald Trump. They've been through this dance with him. They've seen it. So I think, you're balancing a cult that will definitely show up against a guy who might squeak by because people just aren't as afraid of him as they probably should be.
Katie, last word to you. If he's so sly, so savvy, so dangerous, why is he 30 points behind Donald Trump?
Because he sucks. I mean, they're both horrible options. But to your question, Trump is the easier win for Joe Biden. We did it in 2020. We'll do it again in 2024 because Trump will be the nominee for the GOP. They're both terrible options. But to your point, practically speaking, Donald Trump's going to pull it off. Biden's beaten him before. Again, we're going to do it again in 2024.
So at the end of this debate, I've come to the position, and I may change it in 5 minutes, but as of right now, I do think Donald Trump is the more dangerous person in the White House, but I do think actually it would be harder for Joe Biden to beat Ron DeSantis. So we'll leave it at that. Let's see what the viewers think. That does it for me today. Thank you both, by the way, Tom Nichols and Katie Phang. Appreciate you both.